I'm tremendously excited to be here this morning and talk to you about a topic that I'm involved in quite a lot. It's such a massive topic, science and belief in God. You could do 10 straight Sundays on it and still only be doing the introduction. So I've broken this down into 3 parts just to look at 3 small aspects of this topic, but I look forward to your questions afterwards if you've got more you want to ask. Right, so we'll get the point going. Yes, a point means next one. The clicker wasn't working, so here we go. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look firstly at the assumptions that are made today about science and belief in God, whether it's viable and how viable it is. Then we're going to look at some of the questions that the data raise, and I'm going to look at 2 in particular around the issue of convergence. And then we're going to look a little bit historically about what history says about the answer of has science killed God? Okay, so my background, as I said, I wear a number of different hats. My day paid job is I'm the director of Aylesbury Vale Youth of Christ. One day a week I work with Manchester Metropolitan University where I'm on the faculty there. And I'm doing my doctorate there in history and philosophy of science, particularly history and philosophy of physics. So I'm a lecturer and a tutor in the philosophy department at Manchester Metropolitan. I did a degree in theology, which was very kind. I was working for a church and they paid for me to get that for free. So thank you very much. But I did my dissertation, my undergraduate dissertation on theistic evolution, defending theistic evolution. Then I did do 1 year of immunology at Cambridge, decided that wasn't for me, but I did the first year, because why not? But then I switched to genetics. I fell hard in love with genetics at university. I just think it's the most wonderful thing. So that's where I've ended up. But I did a genetics degree at Cambridge. I did a master's in theology, but I did a research master's on a scientist who was a Quaker called Sir Arthur Eddington. We'll hear a lot more about him in a minute. I did a master's in molecular biology at Birkbeck, and now I'm currently doing a PhD in philosophy of science. I'm in the throes of that. And I'm looking at interwar physics there, so Einstein's generation and how they wrestled with the new world, really, that came along when you have relativity, quantum physics, and cosmology, bang, 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 all come along in the space of about 8 years, and it completely overthrew the world, everything we knew about it, everything we thought about it. So I'm looking at that generation, which is very, very interesting. And in the winter, I move into the University of Reading, where I'll be continuing a doctorate there in molecular biology. And this is my protein right here. This is my guy. This is human mut S alpha. Just to put it simply, so I studied DNA repair proteins and a particular DNA repair protein family called mut S, and its sister proteins mut L, and a few others. Proteins are like snowflakes. Every snowflake is a different shape, as you know. But if you then imagine, if you put it into biology terms, imagine that the shape of the snowflake determines the job that it does and how effectively it does that job. That's what proteins are like. And I think they're quite beautiful. I think that's beautiful. I mean, it doesn't literally look like that. That's a ribbon representation of it. But I think proteins are very beautiful. DNA is very beautiful. And you can't help but feel things when you work in it. I'm not going to share it today because there's probably not time, but I had one of the most profound experiences of God in my life came in the lab. Probably the most profound experience of God I've ever had actually came in the lab. Right, but let's get into this. Right, I want to start with a story from Sir Arthur Eddington and this beautiful little gem of a book that was written a century ago called Science and the Unseen World. Arthur Eddington's one of the main interwar physicists, probably the greatest scientist you've never heard of. But he wrote really at the high point in 1929 of this interwar physics book, wrote this book called Science and the Unseen World. And it really moved me, and it made me want to study him in my theology masters. But in it, he says, many people come into my observatory, because he was professor of astronomy at Cambridge, held Isaac Newton's chair. And they look through the telescope and they see the rings of Saturn, they see the stars, and they will turn around to me and my colleagues and they will quote Psalm 19 verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God and the skies show the work of his hands. And he says, many of my colleagues and I will roll our eyes at that. And next one, he says, for me, a different Bible passage comes to mind, a very different one. It's 1 Kings 19, the story of Elijah in the cave. And while Elijah's in the cave, there's a mighty earthquake, but God is not in the earthquake. Then there's a mighty wind, and God is not in the wind. And then there's a roaring fire, but God is not in the fire. And then afterwards comes the still small voice. What are you doing here? Why are you here? And Arthur Eddington, I'm paraphrasing here, says seismology, meteorology, and thermodynamics all are in play in the cave. And they pass by in silence. But afterwards comes the still small voice. What are you doing here? Why are you here, Arthur? And for him, that summarized, that beautifully, it really got me the first time I read it, beautifully summarized for him what science and faith in God did, the way they played together. It was not in the sense data that was coming. It was in the wonder, the significance, the beauty. The data passes by in silence, but the wonder, the still small voice, the questions remain. So I wanted to start with that to get you thinking. But we're going to look at the assumptions first. And the assumptions, these are the various assumptions I hear from atheists. I'll just say I don't hear these assumptions from scientists. If you listen to the online internet atheist crew, my friend Rationality Rules and a few of the other internet atheists, you would think that every single scientist spent all day talking about God's non-existence and working on that. Scientists are not like that. I wonder if they've ever met a scientist in their life. I will talk to you for a couple of hours straight about mute S alpha if you want. We can really dive deep. We love talking about our data and the small things we're interested in. We don't really go around talking about God or belief in God or atheism a great deal. But the assumptions I hear are, firstly, that science has disproven the claims of Scripture. That science itself is a worldview that runs counter to Christianity. So you have science over here and then belief in God over here. And they're competing for the same space. That science changes and grows, whereas Christianity doesn't. That no intelligent scientist could believe in God. And finally, that science will save us and religion just holds us back. So those are the kinds of things I hear from young people or from people who are sort of more of the evangelistic atheists that will talk to me because they know I'm a Christian. So you hear this a lot from atheists and critics. I very rarely hear it from scientists. Let's work through them. The coolest thing about my job is about 3 times a year I get to work with NASA astronauts. In the education side of things with young people. And I want to start with that because last month we lost a real hero. Bill Anders died. The Apollo 8 mission was the first time ever that humans left Earth orbit and went to another body. It's extraordinary. And these guys are heroes to me. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, who died last month. Now, it's most famous, I think, actually, for the photo on the right, which was the most reproduced photo of the 20th century, the Earthrise photo, where they come around behind the moon and they see the Earth rising and they take photos of it. And it's extraordinary, and my dad used to have it on his wall when I was a little boy. Now, something very interesting comes into play here when we think about science and belief in God. Next slide, please. Bill Anders came back from that flight a convinced atheist after that. He said, when I saw the earth there hanging in the black, the idea of a God in heaven that's concerned with whether or not little Johnny said his prayers before bed seemed ridiculous. And Bill Anders went on to be a big supporter of the work of Richard Dawkins and people like that right up until his death. But Jim Lovell, who went on to command Apollo 13, had a very different response. When he was asked what he took away from Apollo 8, he said this, God has given us a stage, but how the story goes is up to us. Now, the point I want to make here is 2 people looking at the exact same data can come to wildly different conclusions. Two people can look at the natural world or look at data from science and come to totally different conclusions as to what it means in a spiritual level or anything like that. So it's not often the data, but the worldview that influences things. Chris Hadfield, my wife took me to hear the famous astronaut Chris Hadfield last year. And Chris Hadfield said that space seems to have this confirmation bias effect. Astronauts who go up who are atheists come back convinced atheists. Astronauts who go up and believe in God come back more convinced than ever about their belief in God. And so often it's not the data that makes the difference. There are other factors at work. Are you ready to play a meme game? I'm going to show you 3 memes, and I would like you to have a think about each one that have done the rounds, and then we'll move on from assumptions. First meme. So this did the rounds about a decade ago on Twitter in particular. Sorry, I'm in your way. I'll get out of the way. 30 seconds. What's wrong with this picture? So there's this girl, you may not be able to see it at the back. There's this girl holding up a sign that her parents probably just given her to hold up. And on the left it says, according to religion, I'm broken, flawed, sinful, dumb, weak, and nothing. On the right, according to science, I'm full of wonder, smart, a great learner, beautiful, potential for greatness. At the bottom, which do you think is damaging? Okay, 30 seconds with the person next to you. What's up with this picture? What's good about it? What's bad about it? Maybe. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip on to the next meme. But there's a number of assumptions there that I would question, certainly. Okay, meme number 2. The Human Genome Project was completed in 2001. It was actually finally completed in 2003. I got a chance to spend the day at Sanger Centre in Cambridge, where it began in the UK, and they've got behind glass a fully printed 3.1 billion letters on paper, the first printed copy of the human genome there from 2001, the first draft. This was a cartoon done by a philosopher who was taking pot shots at the materialistic implications a lot of people were drawing. I'm sorry it's not very clear, there's not many copies of it. But here is the DNA double helix, and it's got arrows pointing to it. This is the part of your DNA that makes you unable to remember to turn off your mobile phone when you're in the cinema. This is the bit of the DNA that makes you willing to spend far too much on a cup of coffee than you would otherwise humanly reasonably do. This is the bit of the DNA that gives you a reality TV fixation, and it's basically the human genome decoded. Yeah, guys, that's just not true. Your DNA doesn't, that's not what DNA does. That's not how it works. But it was a shot from the philosophers of science at some of the materialists who were taking an ultra-materialistic view at what the decoding of the human genome actually meant. Right, and last meme, just about communication and about language. What is it that science actually says? If your girlfriend says she is here for you, she's not talking about velocity. I have a better cartoon of this, of a guy sitting there thinking, and it says, my girlfriend says she needs time and space. I think she's trying to calculate velocity. It's like, no, that's not really what is being said. So sometimes we have a tendency to read into science what's not actually being said. Science communication is big business these days, and it's very, very important, partly because the gap between what the general public actually knows in terms of what science is going on and the science that's actually happening is so big. But secondly, because communicating to people what it actually means is an art, is a skill, and a lot gets lost in language. Science is a tool, it's a method of investigation. It's tremendously successful because of the focus of its work and the modesty of its ambitions. There's nothing like it. It's our best answer for the natural world. However, as John Lennox at Oxford University says, if I give poison to my grandma in order to get her inheritance, science can tell me that's what will happen, but it can't tell me whether or not I should do it. It's not capable of that. Problem with the first meme, science doesn't make value judgments. It doesn't. That's not the language it speaks. Science can tell me the constitution of a person, but it can't tell me their value. It's often claimed that science alone can give us all the answers, or at least point us in the way. But scientists don't act like that. And I just want to use 2 examples to prove that. Scientists don't act like what they do gives all the answers. They never have, and they never do. They never will. I'll give you 2 examples. First example, in January, I was very lucky to be part of a very small group of people who attended a really incredible debate between Lord Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal at Cambridge University, and Robert Zubrin, who's one of the finest rocket scientists on the planet, helped Elon Musk start SpaceX. And he founded the Mars Society. I'm on the board for Mars Society UK. And they were having a debate about whether exploration of Mars should be robotic or human. And it was a fascinating debate. And they were in completely different positions. Rees says we don't need humans to go anywhere in space. Everything can be done with robots. And Zubrin takes a completely different approach. And the thing is, the debate changed when it came to the question of human need. What humans being on Mars would do for human inspiration for the next generation. Once it got into the value side of things, they were agreed on everything. When it came to the scientific practicalities, that's where they disagreed. So we find on issues as big as this, the debate changes when you move away from the science into the values. A much bigger, better example, though, is the next one, which was Asilomar 2. Asilomar is one of the most famous debates on science and ethics in the history of humankind. The first one happened in the 70s about recombinant DNA research. But Asilomar 2 happened a few years ago about the question of human gene editing. Where do we draw the line when it comes to gene editing or genome editing on human beings? And as with the first Asilomar, the scientific community on genomics came together and said, we can't make these decisions ourselves. We can't make these decisions on the data, so we're bringing society into it. Bring in lawyers, bring in governors, bring in educators, bring in philosophers, bring in ethicists. We need to expand the conversation because science alone can't determine what we should do and whether it's right or not. We will guide the data, but this decision needs to be made at a societal level. So scientists don't act as if science is the all-encompassing answer to everything. They don't. Right, let's move on to another part now. The questions raised by science. And I'm going to focus particularly on one area of biology and one area of astrophysics because those are my disciplines. How do we make sense of our place in the universe? Science raises questions for us to answer. Does the Christian have a better answer than the atheist when it comes to philosophy? I think they do. And I want to start with convergent evolution. Now, convergent evolution is the independent evolution of similar structures or features at different periods of time. Creatures that diverged such a long time ago that these features are not inherited, but they show similar features or evolutionary strategies for success. This is also true at the genetic level. So this matters a lot to me in my general research, where proteins or particularly macromolecules from the immune system or viruses show the same independent features or strategies, but they're not related at all. Body plans, think of body plan of a shark for swimming and the body plan of a dolphin. Well, these are unrelated. If you go back, their last common ancestor was so far ago that it's not an inherited strategy, but evolution has given the same advantageous strategies of how you'd move in water. So it's convergent rather than inherited. I've spent a lot of time with Simon Conway Morris, who's professor of paleobiology at Cambridge University, and he's one of the greatest living evolutionary biologists. He wrote a book here, this is me with him, in January. He wrote a book called The Deep Structure of Biology, which I'd really recommend for people who are interested in the science, but also the questions of this. There you go. So in Cambridge, this is a big part of what you study, is convergent evolution. But let's give some examples you'll certainly understand. Eyes, wings, and genes. Evolution is constrained, is what I'm trying to say. It's not random chaos. there are avenues of success that crop up over and over again. It's like nature has a blueprint for life. These are successful avenues, so I'm going to find it again and again in unrelated species, in unrelated organisms. So X-Men can't happen. Sorry, guys. You're not suddenly going to get a jump in evolution where some guy can fly and some girl can shoot lasers from her eyes. It's never going to happen, unfortunately. But there are blueprints in life. Nature follows a few successful avenues that show up again and again. This is why I think if you had life on other planets, it would resemble Earth if you had the same ingredients. Genes are duplicated, protein domains are co-opted and used for other purposes. Creation resembles the song of The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis, or the orchestra, the music playing in the Silmarillion by J.R. Tolkien. It's like God is the master gardener going around saying, let's develop this, let's repurpose this, let's snip that off, let's prune this. It's a lot more of a dialogue, a dance that's going on than the random chaos that someone like Richard Dawkins might say it is. But what about astrophysics? What about the universe? Well, I think the universe is the same, actually. What about cosmic convergence? Because there's also a blueprint for the universe, which is quite fascinating. The cosmos is also constrained. Arthur Eddington unsuccessfully attempted a theory of everything, which was published posthumously. And Eddington was mesmerized by 19 different constants, chief of all the cosmological constants. The universe was written in the language of mathematics, and he was fascinated by this. But its perfection didn't have to be that way. The universe doesn't have to be the way it is. And this was very odd to him, and he's not the only one. He's one of a few, like David Hilbert, who attempted a theory of everything and came stuck on these constants. That the universe has fit into these narrow parameters. It didn't have to. It certainly shouldn't have. There's no guarantee or reason why it would have been that way. And yet it's really tightly constrained. And how can I account for that? And it was difficult for him. Everything is, as Goldilocks would say, just right. Our planet sits in the Goldilocks zone from the sun. It tilts on its axis just right, but it's far more than that. The universe as a whole now has 3 times the number of constants that Eddington knew about in 1945. 3 times as many variables. We shouldn't be here. The universe we inhabit allows life because its properties allow for it by the finest of margins. Like J.B.S. Haldane and Arthur Eddington said, the universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we ever could have imagined. This is real. This is not a Christian invention. I've heard people say this is an invention by Christians to pretend we're special. It's not. I spend a lot of time at the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge. This is a real life thing that people work on, and we're finding new constants and quantities all the time. Fred Hoyle found the importance of the observer completely baffling. He thought it was absolutely insane, complete nonsense. There's no way the universe should be like this at its largest level, but also at the behavior of atoms inside a star. But it was the case. The laws governing atoms, stars, and galaxies are all constrained to the tiniest life-giving parameters, and they don't have to be. And why can we understand them? How come all of this is something that we are able to comprehend? That's something that Einstein got really stuck on. It shouldn't be that way. Dr. David Deutsch talks about this better than anyone, I think. So let's go on to the last bit, because I know I'm racing through some rather big things here. Let's take a brief look at the history of modern science. My PhD's on the wrestling with the new world of the interwar physicists, Einstein, Schrödinger, Heisenberg. Many of these giants wrote philosophical reflections about what the new world was and what it all meant. This dramatic decade or two of overthrowing everything. What does this revolution mean? What world do we now live in? Their reflections were not atheistic at all. And here's a point I really want to emphasize. The story that we believed in God, and then science came along and like a train just smashed it out of the way, and now we know better, and we're just waiting for the Christians and the Hindus and the Muslims and the Buddhists to catch up. It fails on first examination. It doesn't stand up at all. It fails spectacularly. Next slide, please. My research is specifically centered around Eddington, genes, and Milne, a little bit of the biochemist and Nobel laureate Michael Polanyi as well. The great science and faith discussion of the 1920s through to the 1980s was not antagonistic at all. It's very different from that. The Gifford lectures, the Eddington Memorial lectures, the annual gatherings to talk about science and faith on a big scale at an academic level were not atheistic at all. None of them were. I've got the whole collection. Not a single one of them is. They were discussions of integration and dialogue. They were far more around meaning. And I just want to finish with what I think is the best example of this, which is evolutionary biology itself. Next slide. If you study evolutionary biology at university today in the UK, you will study it through the lens of what's called the modern evolutionary synthesis, the MES. And the modern evolutionary synthesis began in 1949, and it was the marriage of genetics and classical Darwinian natural selection, evolutionary biology as it was in the 19th century. And they came together. So now, if you study genetics at university, you have to study evolutionary biology. And if you study evolutionary biology at university, you have to do some genetics. So it's the coming together of that. The modern evolutionary synthesis was vocalized by Julian Huxley, but it was grounded by four men in particular. Ernst Mayr, the great field scientist, but then these three men, Theodosius Dobzhansky, Sewell Wright, and Ronald Fisher. Now, Dobzhansky is a Greek Orthodox, Sewell Wright is a Catholic, and Ronald Fisher was an Anglican. How on earth can evolution be the end of belief in God? The very foundations of how you study it at university are grounded in 3 out of the 4 Bible-believing church-going Christians. So the idea that evolution and Christianity can't go together, or that evolution historically has just swept away Christianity, is a myth. It's a myth that's anti-academic, actually, because it goes against the very thing you study at university if you do this. I've said to Rationality Rules, and some of my friends who are atheist YouTubers on a mass level, they would be shocked if they went to Cambridge at the number of Christians who were there, the number of Christians who are on the faculty of astrophysics and biology and philosophy in particular. I think they'd be stunned. And what you learn at university is very, very different. And Simon Conway Morris and at least 2 others at Cambridge now in the biology faculty at paleobiology are Christians who go to church every week. Right, so finally, in summary, the popular objections to Christianity based on science don't work. I just want to emphasize that they're a myth. You don't have to go very far to overthrow them. The questions raised about our place in the universe are not black and white. They're far more nuanced and they're far more interesting, actually. Once you dig into the unifying sort of blueprint behind biology and also of cosmology, you find there things that are very, very strange. And we shouldn't be surprised, because Einstein said they were strange nearly a century ago. And finally, the narrative that science came along and blew away God fails spectacularly on first examination. And we didn't even get to the fact that, the birth of modern science built on Bacon and Robert Boyle and James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday and Blaise Pascal. These are all deeply Christian people who expected law and order in the universe and believed that we had the mind of God so we could go and investigate it and use it, and saw that as a form of worship. But even more recent history, the history I deal in, which is more the interwar stuff, is a very different picture. So science has not killed God. I don't think it's capable of doing that. I don't think it can do that. It works in a different realm, it speaks a different language, and history shows otherwise. Thank you. I hope that was interesting, and look forward to any questions you have.